And so, as ever, we are bumping up against those boundaries of language, of ontology, epistemology. We are slowly getting to the blurred fringes of the reading experience where to really go beyond it and to immerse ourselves into it would be to go into a place where language, as I need to be able to utilize it to express anything to you through this video, is impossible. Hey everybody, thank you as always for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we are resuming our Why Do We Read Fiction series. This is a series that I started at the beginning of this year, and we got 6 episodes in, and then my summer sabbatical hit. And so here we are resuming it with episode 7. I plan, even though, it's October, my favorite month. Well, one of my favorite months. October, November, December are like the trifecta for me, the triumvirate. But even though we only have 3 months left, I want to get 12 episodes in. 12 just seems right to me. If I did 6 before the sabbatical, it's just symmetrical and therefore sort of numerically satisfying for me to get 6 more for a good even 12 episodes by the end of this year. So I hope you're enjoying the series, and I hope that you'll stick around to see what else we have to explore when we question why it is that we read fiction. So just to clarify, this series is not why should we read fiction, but rather we're just presuming that you're already a reader of fiction, and we're investigating why it is that we keep coming back. And the last 2 episodes were specifically about rereading. And so that made it even more interesting because it's rereading now really kind of puts an interesting spin on thinking about why we read fiction, because obviously we are storytelling creatures. We love stories, but obviously when we reread and reread, there's something more going on than just the story, because at that point we know the story. In any case, I'm just going to do a little recap of where we left off so that anybody who's new to the series and hasn't watched the first 6 episodes kind of knows what we've hit on so far, and then we'll dive into this current episode. So we kicked it off with episode 1, and I used Living by Fiction by Annie Dillard, and the title of that episode was Fiction Imparts Something Missing from the World Outside. And just a quick summary, I'm going to run through these. Annie Dillard and William H. Gass posit that great fiction imparts something to the reader that doesn't exist in the world outside. Yet, Dillard also asserts it is the very constraint of reality that keeps literature alive and healthy. What is this symbiotic connection between literature and reality, then, that makes it possible for readers to experience this process of fiction's augmented reality? So that's what I talk about in the first episode. Then we moved on and we used The Reading Life, a compendium of work from C.S. Lewis, to talk about enriching individuality, escaping provincialism, and enchanting reality. And C.S. Lewis says that reading fiction heals the wound inflicted by individuality without undermining the privilege, the unique privilege of individuality. I love that. We transcend and enrich ourselves by opening up to other selves, even when we are alone, meaning alone reading a book. He also brilliantly claims that fiction doesn't damage our view of reality because reality pales in comparison, but rather it makes reality more enchanted. So again, this idea that reality brings something into fiction, operates on the reader, and then returns to bestow something into reality. But what is that elusive something? Episode 3 got pretty deep. We used Why We Read, an article by Brian Counter, and On Reading by Marcel Proust, and then Reading's Residue by Peter Schwanger. And quoting from Proust, the title of that was The Only Calendars of Days We Have Lost. Brian Counter and Peter Schwanger point to Proust's preface to his Ruskin translations to show that there is something deeper than memory of the book's contents that entangles our lives with the fiction we read. Proust says that books are the only calendars of the days we have lost, but he makes the claim more complex by asserting that the distractions we encounter in the real world while we read are necessary for that binding, that intertwining. Schwanger refers to this property as reading's residue. I love that. And takes cues from Proust, Mattei Calinescu, and Gerald Murnane to investigate what we can know about this residue. In the end, there appears to be something within us that fiction activates, touches, enlarges, whether we're conscious of it or not, that goes deeper than the book's contents. When we see the spine of a book we read long ago, we often first involuntarily recall the atmosphere and the sensation of where we were when we were reading it, especially if we encountered a disruption or a distraction, sort of like Proust's response to the Madeleine in the Lime Blossom Tea. Murnane says that this distance that occurs after, sometimes long after a book has been read, allows for new images and feelings to emerge from the experience of having read. Hence, we are locked in an integrated cycle with the writer, the fiction, our memories, and our experience of the world as it relentlessly intrudes upon our reading. Thus, it seems we are compelled to reread for a deeper reason than just a book's contents. I turned to rereading as therapy, and I took my cue from Unfinished Business by Vivian Gornick. She presents the act of rereading as a means of putting oneself on the analyst's couch again and again as one changes throughout life. The books that speak most to us can seem to grow alongside us as we age and mature. We learn about ourselves by observing the behavior and situations of others. Rereading also teaches us how to discern nuance and cultivates our ability to reevaluate and reformulate conclusions. And so that episode raises interest in exploring both rereading and literature as therapy more deeply. And first we went with rereading. And for the next two episodes, we looked at rereading by Mattei Calinescu. In the first one, we talked about the heuristic impulse, and in the second one, the ludic impulse. Calinescu agrees that we have this heuristic impulse within us to search for things, or more specifically, this hope of discovery. Even if we don't make a particular discovery with this or that book, each act of reading increases that drive for and our confidence of making a novel discovery. Reading fulfills the longing of discovery by, at the very least, giving us time to engage in the search and keeps our heuristic faculties sharpened. I believe that within readers of fiction is a need to create. And the richest fiction that offers the most intensive search brings out the creative readers within us. The author's creating gives us an opportunity to engage in a reader's creating. And the ludic impulse refers to that part of us that likes to engage in games and puzzles and mysteries. When we first read a book, we are, of course, getting acquainted with its design. So when there's a high ludic quotient, such as Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov in a book's design, this triggers the impulse to read again and again, because each reading unveils a sense of unfinished business and leads us to wanting to make further discoveries. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves today. And today, I want to talk about finding a vocabulary of one's own. And I'm taking my cue from Elena Ferrante's collection of 3 talks that she wrote but did not give. She is famously reclusive, famously hires actresses to go and present things on her behalf, as she did here. So this is at an Umberto Eco conference that happens in Italy, and she hired an actress there to give 3 talks, and then there is an essay that she wrote, Dante's Rib. And this is a pretty nice little compendium, and would be great for people, not only people who love Ferrante. I actually have not read any of her fiction yet, but it would also be great for anybody interested, of course, in reading and writing. It's called In the Margins on the Pleasures of Reading and Writing. And I'm just going to note a couple of highlights here. She says, the way we see ourselves dragging outside by means of the written word, an imaginary inside, which is by its nature fleeting, deserves more attention in discussions of literature. And she's talking about writers specifically. And it correlates to another book that I've read that we're going to turn to in the next episode, but that is A History of Books by Gerald Murnane. And he really takes up that charge, even though I think actually his came first maybe, but he really takes up that charge about that imaginary self or the image self and the written word's ability to draw out the image self or the imaginary self from the writer, but also from the reader. She says everything begins for the writer with pencil and paper. Then a surprising split takes place. The eye of the writer separates from its own thought and in separation sees that thought. It's not a fixed, well-defined image. The thought vision, compound word, appears as something in motion. It rises and falls, and its task is to make itself evident before disappearing. And so if we flip that around from the writer to the reader, we could say that for the reader, it starts with the words on the page, whereas for the writer, it started with pencil and paper. And then as you read, this surprising split takes place, and you are at once two selves. Your self in the world, and then your self that comes into being while you're reading. And I know it sounds very metaphysical, very mystical. And in fact, when we get to Rita Felski on the uses of literature in a few episodes, we'll see that she's at pains to sort of tamp that down and get more of a handle on literature and reading. But for now, let us go there. The challenge, I thought and think, is to learn to use with freedom the cage we're shut up in. And immediately I'm hearing Lyle and Lamont from Infinite Jest. It's a painful contradiction. How can one use a cage with freedom? Whether it's a solid literary genre or established expressive habits or even the language itself. And so there is the cage. The cage in this case would be our book. And just like Lyle admonishes Lamont, I think the very first step is to acknowledge the fact of the cage and to learn that when we read and this split of the self occurs, the one self is in the cage or the limits defined by the reading experience. But if we extend it to Proust and the idea of interruption in the world around us while we read, then we allow all of that in as well. And so the cage, while still there, is already expanded. And then in the Dante's Rib essay, it says, even when Dante emphasized his successes, he couldn't avoid the idea that encasing human experience in the alphabet is an art susceptible to searing disappointments. And so as ever, we are bumping up against those boundaries of language, of ontology, epistemology. We are slowly getting to the blurred fringes of the reading experience where to really go beyond it and to immerse ourselves into it would be to go into a place where language, as I need to be able to utilize it to express anything to you through this video, is impossible. But there are a couple of things that I want to draw out from what I've read. Number one is, of course, like I've been saying, there is the notion of this self, this immanent metaphysical self, this imaginary self, and what Murnane will call the image self, as we'll see in the next episode. But there is this book-born self in the life of a reader. And we can actually use our books, use all of our reading experiences and those interruptions and environments from the world outside that were very real to us, though relegated at the time of reading until they interrupted and thus reasserted themselves, that are binding that image self, that book self, to all that we have read. And that image self is ever expanding and ever augmenting, and the cage is ever enlarging with each book that we read. And to sort of bring us back a little bit from this sort of numinous realm that we're in, I want to suggest what Mark Edmondson says in his wonderful little book, Why Read? He takes a cue from pragmatist Richard Rorty, who says all human beings carry about a set of words which they employ to justify their actions, their beliefs, and their lives. These are the words in which we formulate praise of our friends and contempt for our enemies, our long-term projects, our deepest self-doubts, and our highest hopes. They are the words in which we tell, sometimes prospectively and sometimes retrospectively, the story of our lives. And Rorty calls this our final vocabulary or our final language. And final here is more used as a terminus, not that it's closed and not like a draft, that this is a final draft, because with each book we read, this is ever changing. But at any moment in time, this is finally our vocabulary. And I think that it is very much bound up with that book self, that image self. And he goes on and says that Rorty believes that we ought to be constantly challenging, testing, refining, and if need be, overthrowing our ultimate terms and stories, replacing them with others that serve us better. And Edmondson goes on to say that, for most people, and I think he's got in mind here non-readers, for most people, they never stray far from their initial narratives, the values that they're imprinted with when they're growing up. And it says most of us just stay at home, where it's comfortable. And so for Edmondson, reading is very much an opportunity to ever challenge, refine, and expand that final vocabulary that is bound up with both the self in the world and the self in the books.